On April 2nd, Trump introduced a new tariff plan for the United States, which set the financial markets ablaze and escalated international trade tensions to maximum. Since then, there has been a relentless barrage of reporting on the tariff plan across all media outlets, and Trump's economic team has been on a nonstop PR campaign to justify a policy that has been portrayed as amateurish and reckless. But as the saying goes, you know you're over the target when you start to experience flack from every direction. With the policies which have undergirded decades of global trade relations now under threat by a White House which claims to not be concerned about diplomatic niceties nor rising stock market prices, all in an effort to restore America's industrial dominance, it is time to ask a few long-ignored questions about globalization, which many in positions of power might find politically inconvenient. Specifically, was the WTO built by lawyers and economists to fail? Will Trump's plan be able to address widespread practices of tariff evasion? What is the actual linchpin for American re-industrialization? And what might a more diplomatic industrial policy actually look like? Welcome back to Inconvenient Questions, a weekly podcast where we ask questions about a variety of cultural, economic, and intellectual topics which are politically inconvenient, and we let you determine just who they are inconvenient for. My name is Clifford, and I am joined by my friend and practicing mathematician Jeffrey. We are recording this episode on the evening of April 6th, 2025, and boy, do we have an interesting discussion for you today. So let's get started.
Well, let me ask right away, what do you think about Trump's tariffs?
I do not know enough about economic consequences, but I think that I have a different perspective on how the tariffs should have been implemented. And Is that what you want to know?
Sure.
Okay.
I want to know what you think.
Sure. Well, there's a number of different elements to what I think. I'll start with the fact that I think it was actually ingenious that the Trump administration decided that it was going to use the trade imbalance as a way to capture the forest from the trees. It turns out that there are lots of different ways to disrupt free and fair trade. One of them is through tariffs. That's the obvious one. That's the thing that the WTO is designed to, I guess, adjudicate. But we know that there are a variety of other mechanisms that are just as bad or sometimes worse at disrupting and distorting trade between nations. And so there are things like currency manipulation, state subsidies. There's also the laws that, like, for example, Europe has with regard to branded products. So you can't sell cheddar cheese unless it's made in cheddar, because they have effectively taken a whole range of products and I guess encumbered them with licenses that are tied to the location. So champagne in Europe is only sparkling wine made in Champagne. And I believe that this is a component of trade distortion, that it was enacted in order to limit the import of similar products into European countries, so as to protect domestic industries. And they did it, and this is not a tariff. It's like a legal requirement for the naming of products, right? And they also in Europe have a variety of other restrictions, either based off of health concerns about genetically modified organisms, or other laws that effectively limit the ability for American producers to sell in Europe, and so there are all these intricate ways that countries come up with favoring domestic industries by sheltering them from international competition. And the United States is no different, right? The United States subsidizes its corn industry ridiculously, right? Like, why there is an ethanol mandate, I believe comes down to sort of guaranteeing revenues to voters in Iowa. But like
Of
in
course,
any
that makes our corn more expensive on the international markets, not less expensive. It makes it less competitive.
Correct, but what I'm saying too is that it makes it more expensive for U.S. consumers as well, right?
Consumers, right?
My point is that there are probably 101 or 1,001 different ways to construct barriers to trade that distort markets in favor of domestic suppliers. And rather than do what an economist or a lawyer would do and try to like enumerate every single one of these things and model out how it affects prices, which is like a Sisyphusian task, because by the time you figure out the model for one thing, there's probably three more that have entered the economic system. The What I think is rather ingenious about the Trump administration is that they looked at and they said, we don't need to look at all these rules. There's too many of them. This is a waste of time. What we believe, and I think this is the ingenious part of it, is like what we believe is that all these rules result in outcomes. And so we're just going to measure the outcome. And because we believe that the United States has a robust, complex economy, meaning like if you look through economic data, you'll see that economic complexity is usually detailed in the range of different products that a country can produce. So there are certain products that the United States can't produce. I think I don't know of very many domestic suppliers of mangoes, for example. But across a wide variety of different products, the United States is a producer of those things. Now, that means that if there's a trade imbalance, there must be some reason why the United States producers are not being able to sell their goods abroad to balance out the trade, right? Like it's sort of a big picture approach to this problem, saying that trade imbalances reflect market distorting laws, policies, regulatory actions, and a variety of other things.
Of course, we do understand that it's also true that trade imbalances reflect economics, right? A country that's growing faster is going to have a
Yes, and so the famous case is Lesotho.
Lesotho.
So, like, I believe that Lesotho got some attention because it had, I think, one of the highest tariff rates introduced on Trump's chart, and people were like,
Mm-hmm.
"We didn't know that Lesotho was such a free trade abuser," and it turns out that the reason that the tariffs are really high is because Lesotho does not have a large enough consumer base or a wealthy enough consumer base to buy very many American products. As a result,
Right.
the limited amount of things it does trade to the United States vastly outweigh the things that it purchases from the United States. And it's not because Lesotho has predatory rules against U.S. imports. It's just that their population is not inclined, mostly due to economic reasons, to be able to buy imports from the United States. And so, as a result, by using trade balance ratios as a proxy, I think that you adequately capture the imbalances created from distortionary policies from robust competitive economies like Europe and China, right? I think you do get those, but there's a lot of small states that are going to get roped up, and abused in the process because they are not. It's not actually because of, I guess, predatory legislation. It's just that, as you suggested, sometimes certain industries or certain areas are more, they produce more than others, right? And so there's just going to be economic irregularities and inequalities in trade,
Hmm.
especially across the world system, in especially from countries that don't have robust complex economies, right? So this policy might actually be counterproductive for them. But I'm suggesting to you that I still think that there's a little there's sort of an ingenuity here in trying to get away from the legalistic approach that the
Hmm.
WTO encouraged and
Hmm.
ultimately demonstrated that it completely was incapable of enforcing, right?
Well, one criticism of the WTO that I've always had is that it encourages legalism, and the actors who are the best at manipulating the system aren't the actors that you want to, as a matter of public policy, subsidize. Uh, for example, in many parts of the developing world, government structures are weak and corrupt, and the people who are supposed to be advocating for consumers and producers inside a small poor country often don't have anybody advocating for them because they're just lining their own nests.
Yeah, and I would add to my analysis of the ingenuity of this approach that I also think that as long as these tariff rules are adjusted in real time to reflect real time adjustments in trade imbalances, that this might even address the evasions that have occurred due to restrictions or bans on certain products coming from certain countries. So I know
Hmm.
you and I, for example, have talked about honey coming out of China in the past. And surprise, surprise, when the US imposed a moratorium or a restriction on honey coming out of China, like within a year,
All the countries around China started
yeah, there was a tremendous increase in the amount of honey coming from Malaysia.
bunch of busy bees in Malaysia. Yeah.
Exactly. So suddenly all the bees decided, hey, we can't sell our products. We got to fly ourselves to Malaysia and get busy. Well, of course, we know that there's something called transshipping. And transshipping is when one location takes goods and places it on either a different ship or puts it in a depot and then ships it out. Singapore is probably the biggest single location in the entire world when it comes to transshipping. A little tidbit of information is that I believe that they are literally the world's largest sand exporter. And you're like, how in the world could
Uh-huh.
a small island be the largest sand exporter in the world? Well, as long as you understand how transshipping works, you can suddenly now understand how it could be. And so places like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries around China just had ships from China temporarily dock, maybe change their flag, maybe repaint the name on the ship. I don't know exactly how this gig works, but the cost of doing it is minimal. And then those ships would proceed to the United States coming from Malaysia. And of course, that was a way to evade country related restrictions. When he first announced these tariffs, I was thinking, oh man, this is going to be like widespread evasion. But then it dawned on me that as long as these trade imbalances are adjusted in real time, the evasion can only be a temporary thing. Because if suddenly Malaysia's trade imbalance, if everything coming from China goes to Malaysia and then Malaysia comes to the US, then Malaysia's going to have a giant trade imbalance and the tariffs for Malaysia will go up, right? So no matter what place you find, if you send enough goods through that area, as long as the tariff rate is adjusted in real time to reflect real time trade imbalances, that exploit only works once, right, before it immediately results in tariffs. And on top of that, what would end up happening is the people who run these countries would be livid because if suddenly China sends all of its honey through Malaysia and now Malaysia's tariff rate goes from 10 to 15, everybody in every other industry in Malaysia would be livid, right? Because like they would lose sales because Chinese transshippers are sending honey through their economy. And I know that a lot of leaders in these countries have been bought off by the Chinese. That's effectively what debt trap diplomacy has meant, right? Like that China goes around the world writing, well, not China, state-backed entities with state-backed banks go around bribing local officials to build infrastructure, which with debt that cannot be repaid based off of increased economic activity, knowing that by the time that the debt comes due, the person that received all these bribes has put that money in a Swiss bank account. Half of his family is in Europe, and the Chinese are going to move in and reclaim that infrastructure now for China, right? So, like that's the MO for the Belt and Road Initiative, and so I have no doubt that there's a variety of officials in these countries that are facilitating transshipping for Chinese firms that are in China's pockets. I mean, there's also a lot of leaders in that area that have been negotiating with Western companies as well. So it's not just China that's involved here, right? Globalization is really being orchestrated by the major multinational companies and the financiers behind them. Like those are the people that have been orchestrating the globalization erosion of industry in the West for the last 40 years. And so it just turns out that right now China happens to be the biggest beneficiary as a nation for this trend or this dynamic, and of course its leadership has benefited dramatically from it and is more than willing to sacrifice their own population's health and prosperity to participate, right? But in any case, I think that like what I'm seeing here is a rather nifty, simple way of addressing this problem, and so I want to give it credit, right? Like because I think, as you pointed out, the WTO encouraged legalism, and I think that's the last thing that we want to do. So that's like half of what I was going to say. The other part, the criticism, I can also mention, but I can also wait if you wanted to chime in here and have your own perspective.
No, go ahead. What's your criticism?
Okay. Well, my criticism is I think that what this has done has made public the long-standing conflicts that the United States has had with even friendly nations. So suddenly, every nation in the world, the populations in them see this as sort of aggressive, as Trump picking a fight, without being aware that this issue has been simmering under sort of the guise of being diplomatic for a very long time. And as a result, like I'm waiting to see how it plays out. I'm giving the administration a lot of benefit of the doubt right now to see where it goes. But this has the potential to backfire by creating, I guess, alliances outside the U.S. trade system that if it was coordinated, if people that have previously been seen as being involved in the U.S. policed global system realize that they might fare better by creating new trade arrangements and excluding the United States. There's the possibility that the United States, who has, for the most part, eroded a substantial portion of its fundamental industrial capacity, could end up being excluded from significant portions of the global economy. Right. And that's what concerns me, is that by trying to do this all at once, rather than looking at this as a divide and conquer, that Trump is sort of rushing it in a way that I can understand because of promises made during the campaign and limited time before the next midterm elections, and of course a 4-year term that ends in 3 years and I guess 9 months. But the thing about it is that usually what they say strategically is when you find yourself with enemies all around you, you don't try and fight all of your enemies at once. You try and pick off the easy ones at the beginning, consolidate your power first, then move up the ladder. And so, from that perspective, it seems to me like there could have been a different approach to addressing the fundamental goal, I think, behind these tariffs. And that goal, as I see it, is twofold. One,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it is about securing resources and supply chains that it has become clear and has been clear for over a decade now to most people in the Pentagon, to military planners, that the United States is very reliant upon this system of trade, and that when you trace back the origin of every component in every part of the U.S. security system, and it's not just the military. I'm talking about also our electrical grid and the infrastructure that we have. I've heard stories that transformers, for example, are it takes very long time to get a new transformer, and the transformers are a component of the electrical grid that I've been told are not produced in the United States, and that the lead times on replacing them are substantial. So you could see a situation where an attack on the electrical grid could potentially leave a very large portion of the United States without electricity for a while, and that the United States would not have the capacity to turn it back on for lack of the proper equipment. And so, from my perspective, I think that the first primary lens is national security, and that includes infrastructure security. That the United States needs to make sure that it either domestically produces all the things that go into its national security, or that it has control over all of the, I guess,
Choke
locations.
points.
Yeah, all the choke points and all the locations where the supply chain goes through. And so I know there's been discussions about friendshoring, right? And that's the concept that you would you don't necessarily need to bring it all domestically back to the United States, but you do need to sort of do an evaluation of the global map and say, what if this country is suddenly hostile to the United States? What kind of products are we no longer going to be able to produce? And if it turns out that certain countries show up as not being able to replace components of the electrical grid, you might want to reevaluate your global ambitions, right? Because if that country decided, for example, that it didn't want to supply these things anymore, perhaps because it was hostile, that is a vulnerability. So I think that that's one side of it. The second side of it is the promises that Trump has made to MAGA, to a substantial portion of the American population that has not prospered as much as primarily the coastal cities in the age of globalization. And so I think Trump is looking at this as I think he's looking to establish policies that will restore prosperity to the Americans that were left behind, the types of Americans, the populations that were left behind by globalization. And that, gets translated as good paying jobs, manufacturing facilities or plants in the heartland, various different economic activity where people who have seen their towns dwindle and disappear so that the only people that are left in them is old people on retirement, on a pension, and for whom suicide rates are high, opioid use is high, depression is high. That these people are, their concerns and their situation is addressed in a way that hasn't been addressed by the Democratic Republican Uniparty for a long time. And so I see Trump's goals as twofold. I see it as trying to evaluate and secure the supply chain behind our national security apparatus and infrastructure, and simultaneously provide well-paying jobs and economic opportunities for entrepreneurial businesses in the heartland of the United States. And if that is the goal, and maybe I'm not right that that's the goal, but if that was the goal, then I look at the tariffs and I say, is this actually what you want to do? Is this the best way of achieving it? Because I'm not sure it is. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but my own perspective, and I've shared it with a number of people at this point, is that this is about deindustrialization throughout the West, and specifically in the United States. That we have been led to believe by economists that a service-based economy is, I guess, superior to one that involves manufacturing or industry. And I think that this is a deception. I think it is a delusion that has propagated as a result of a deception by economists that work for financiers that want to financialize our economy and who look at industry as a very capex expensive, low profit margin business. And so they'd rather focus their attention on flipping real estate than which is profitable to financiers, than in reinvesting money in capital-intensive areas of the economy. And as a result, I think what has happened is that the industrial base, which when you actually look at the productivity of it, is very high. Like manufacturing is a high value add activity. It not only generally produces good jobs for people, but it also takes advantage of automation in a way that serving coffee to people in Starbucks or cutting people's hair at Supercuts, or even like providing therapy to people online, all these service sector jobs just cannot do. And I think that what has happened because of this focus on like the educational class and on financialization and profit margins, what we've seen is globalization has become an excuse for destroying an industry that's actually remarkably productive and provides people with good jobs. So for me, I bring this all together and I say, if the two goals are national security and better economic opportunities for Trump's support base, both of those seem to be tied to reindustrialization. And if reindustrialization is sort of what you need to focus on, then the question is how do you best do that? And I'm not suggesting that I know all the answers, but the part that I want to chime in on is, what is the critical bottleneck in the industrial capacity of the United States right now? And if reindustrialization is the goal, let's look at the components of it. What makes an industrial economy? If industrialization is ultimately focused on the production of goods as opposed to the production of services, let's look at like the supply at the chain of manufacturing in goods. And if you want to start from the beginning and work your way upward, or you want to start from the end and work your way backward, it doesn't really matter. So let me just start from the base and then work my way towards the end. You have a system of raw material extraction. So like these are your miners for the most part, but they're also like farmers and commodity producers, right? That process usually involves some preliminary processing of the raw materials into what is called concentrate, or mining industry, or in the agricultural industry, it might be like putting the grain in a silo so that it's ready for shipping. Right at the next stage, there is what is called the refiners or the processors in this stage. So in metal, you have smelters. And then in the agricultural space, it would be the millers, right? Like people who translate wheat into flour, right? So something that's raw gets turned into a refined good that can then be added as an input component that's later on going to be, finally make its way to the consumer. So you have the refining process right after the extraction process. At that point in time, you have the component production. So you have making components out of the refined ingredients. And then from the component section, you have the assembly into the finished good. And of course, you can have multiple steps, right? Like there can be components that get assembled into bigger components that get assembled into bigger components. So like there could be a lot of different steps, but I'm trying to simplify it just so that we understand that there's like 4 stages here. There's the extraction, refining, component production, and assembly. And what I understand is that assembly, especially of certain things, is pretty costly if it requires human hands, because of the fact that it's a time-consuming process to assemble things, which is primarily the reason that Apple set up its its assembly process in China using Foxconn, right, as its contractor.
Well, well, I'm not entirely sure that's true, but go on.
Okay. The advance of robotics in manufacturing indicates to me that this is not the bottleneck, that assembly can actually be done through an automated robot-assisted process pretty effectively. And so even if you have to pay people higher wages in the United States, the level of productivity that you get due to a robot assistance actually makes it possible for cars to be assembled in the United States by foreign manufacturers, right? So Hyundai, Honda, the Toyota, like all of these companies, they assemble their products in the United States because it turns out that like when you include the state of the art assembly processes that we have available, it is a bit of a wash between doing it in another country and then shipping it versus doing it in the United States. And so I don't think that the bottleneck here is assembly. I don't think that the bottleneck is extraction either. The reason I say that is twofold. One, the United States actually has a lot of mines and a lot of natural resources that are currently being used, and there's a lot of resources that could be easily turned on. And the reason that
easily from a technical point of view, but from a legal point of view, a bureaucracy point of view, it's quite difficult to start a new mine in the United States.
It is.
I mean, it's been decades since it's happened, right?
What I'm trying to suggest to you is that so in a national emergency, an actual real one that involved a war, you would find that these legal restrictions very quickly disappear. And I don't think that that's the limiting factor. And the reason that I don't think it's the limiting factor is because I also know that there are plenty of other countries that are producing all the raw commodities throughout the world that are friendly nations with the United States. So, I mean, if the United States does, for legal reasons, doesn't want to set up a copper mine in the United States, that doesn't mean that there aren't copper mines in Canada, there aren't copper mines in Australia or in South America. There's plenty of places to get these things. And when it comes down to it, if you look at the financial statements of these producers, they're not rolling in dough, right? Commodities are called commodities for a reason. They're commodified, which means that you have a lot of producers, and in the end, the margins for most of these operations are thin. They're tight, and this occurs in agriculture as well as mining and minerals. And so I don't see that being as the bottleneck, because there are options, if necessary, in the United States that could be wiped away if it was absolutely necessary. But in the meantime, even if it wasn't necessary, there's plenty of suppliers of these throughout the world that are not tied to specific potential future adversaries. Mm-hmm. So that's why I cross extraction off of the list, even though that is what all of the people who talk about bring, drill baby drill, or bringing, getting rid of regulations. They all focus on extraction. That's not. I don't know if this is their ignorance or deliberate deception, but it's really not the focus if you're looking to establish where the bottleneck is in manufacturing. The bottlenecks really are in component manufacturing and refining. And I believe that the bottleneck in component manufacturing is actually a downstream derivative of the refining bottleneck. Because it turns out that if you have a country that is producing a large amount of refined ingredients for component manufacturers, surprise, surprise, those component manufacturers set up factories very, very close to where those refineries are. Mm-hmm. They create a sort of positive feedback loop economically between the refinery and the component.
Right. Exactly.
And component manufacturing. Once again, you can use robotics to do this, right? I think the United States is in a position where you can just apply basic level machine tooling to make as many components as you need if you have a steady, reliable, and cost-effective supply of the raw ingredients. And so,
well, for some components, right?
For some components, yes.
But I mean, for things that need to be drop forged, for example, I mean, you need to have economies of scale, and once you've shut down a pressure forge, it's difficult to start back up again. I mean, you're starting from a baseline of zero.
Yeah, and so that's I think you and I are, after going through this in a sort of meticulous fashion, I'm trying to get us to focus on the refining and processing side of it, because that's the part that's missing in the United States, that's actually vital to the industrial process, because if it goes away, you are high and dry, right? You no longer have the capacity for your component manufacturers to function economically. And so now you have to outsource your component manufacturing. And once you've outsourced your component manufacturing, then, assembly sounds like it's something that you would outsource too, right? So like, as a result, it's sort of like, I see the key element for re-industrialization on refining. And if it is, and the reason I point in this direction is because we already have evidence about the U.S. vulnerability in looking at who is actually performing almost all the refining in the world right now. In almost every single metal and mineral, every rare earth. You want to guess which country controls?
Well, of course, it's China. They've been subsidizing it for decades.
Correct.
That was part of Mao's Great Leap Forward. What was backyard pig iron smelting.
Suffice to say, with Western help, they've gotten much better at it. Maybe not better at preventing pollution, but much better at controlling the industry. And as a result, their component manufacturers have an economic advantage being located in China, and their assembly has an economic advantage with their component manufacturers being in China. So I see this as fundamentally, if Trump's vision is about bringing good jobs to the parts of America that have been left behind, let's call that the heartland, and about making sure that the national security apparatus that includes civilian infrastructure as well is not vulnerable to foreign supply chains. I see it as entirely about the lack of refining and processing capacity in the United States. And if that's the case, then what I'm suggesting to you is that I don't think that this, to get back to your original question, I don't think that these tariffs are actually going to address this. That I would approach this in a different way, and this is the way I would approach it. I have two ideas for how to do this, and they both work in tandem. So the first is I think that the United States should set up strategic reserves for every single refined product that is necessary in its national security apparatus, right? So instead of releasing helium into space and letting oil go down to nothing and neglecting the plutonium 238's stockpile and doing all these crazy ideas about basically running our stockpiles dry, including like PPEs, right? Before a pandemic, they're suddenly empty.
But they weren't suddenly empty; they've been empty for years.
Well, but my
Right?
point is that the people that are responsible for globalization are precisely the same political officials that made decisions to eliminate these strategic reserves, and so I'm not necessarily looking to assign blame. We could go down that direction, and I have plenty of people that I can assign blame to. But moving forward, what I think is that the United States should establish itself as a buyer of these materials at a good price that would signal for anybody that is willing to invest in things like building a smelter, that there's going to be a steady multi-year, like we're talking about not just multi-year, but perhaps multi-decade buyer at a specific price that would make that process economical for them to invest in. And this buyer, I mean, at one point in time, there was literally the U.S. was literally stockpiling cheese. Have you heard about that?
Right.
Like I thought it was a joke.
As a kid, right?
I thought it was a joke.
No. And they ran out of place to put the cheese, so they started handing the cheese out. So cholesterol levels, of course, took a hit there.
Yeah, and so like when I was playing a game that involved government contracts, one of the couple of the older people that were playing with me, because at the time I was in my early 20s and they were probably in their like late 30s, early 40s, they were calling it the government contract like token government cheese, and I was like, okay, if that's what you want to call it. It wasn't until like literally the last month that I heard about this government cheese program. And now I understand exactly what it was. And of course, it was a subsidy for the American dairy industry. And that industry doesn't need subsidies because that is not a strategic vulnerability. On the other hand, I could list probably 30 or 40 different minerals that are a strategic national security vulnerability. And if the United States maintained, committed to stockpiling enough of that to ensure a minimum bid for those materials, then I think that, and they also, to your point about regulations, made sure that the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, the Department of the Interior worked in league with people who want to invest in capex expenditures to build these smelters. If they basically signal we are going to be a buyer and what we're going to buy it for is going to be economic for you to do, then I think we can build up that stockpile, which not only in the future ensures that we have supply if we need it, right? Like to really ramp up production in any particular field, we would have that surplus supply. But it also, in some senses, if you believe in inflation, would make the government a future seller of it in a positive direction, right? This could be an investment for the government, not just an investment in the economic industry. It could actually make a profit in the end. And that's one side of how I see this, right? Setting up strategic reserves and making it so that the only people who can sell to them are domestic producers. So you cannot sell from any other source than domestic refiners, right? We don't care where you get the raw materials. Like you can import the raw materials from another country, but it's the refined ingredients. Those are the things that we will be stockpiling. And for a lot of this stuff, it doesn't perish. So like the government can do that. And it would and if they did it carefully, and it's not really complex, right? If they did it carefully, I think it would be the carrot, and then the stick. What I think that the policy of the trade policy of the United States should be to work in tandem with the stockpiled reserves is to identify every single product that contains one or more of these elements, of these metals, that is the policy of the government to encourage local refining and processing, and to examine what component, to apply a tariff on products that contain those metals and minerals proportional to the amount of, I guess, economic disparity or subsidization that is occurring in other countries, especially China, because in truth, China is responsible for the price of almost all of these, what I'd like to call reserve metals, and to adjust the price of all goods coming into the United States according to the disparity between what should be the market price for these particular products if they reflected the cost of refining and processing this within the United States, so that no matter where the product is coming from, whether it's coming through another country other than China, we are effectively making sure that the products that are coming into the United States don't take advantage of this below market rate and subsidization process associated with refining and processing. However, this would allow for the allies of the United States in the global trade system to demonstrate through the provenance of their component supply chain the opportunity to be exempted, or I guess I should say not just the countries, but individual companies, through providing provenance, could be exempted from these additional tariffs by demonstrating that the products that they are trying to sell in the United States are made with components which are made from materials that were refined in locations that had appropriate market rates for them. Or just straight out saying that if the components came from materials processed and refined in the United States, that if the producer of, or the seller of the product, could demonstrate through the provenance that it was coming from the United States, that would exempt them from the tariffs. And that would provide the stick to accompany the carrot of an insured price level to encourage domestic investment in capital intensive industries like metal processing. So, what is your perspective on the tariff situation? What do you think about what I've said, and what has transpired, and how the tariffs have been introduced in this past week?
Well, I think what I think really doesn't matter because he's talked about it for a year. People are generally supportive of it, and unfortunately, democracy, the majority gets its way from time to time. Um, I think the idea of doing them all at once from a game theory point of view was an intelligent move. I don't understand why they didn't have why they made the tariffs come into effect immediately, right? We would have had the same effect if the tariffs, as far as I could tell, if the tariffs say came into effect 90 days from today, uh, just not only to reduce disruption, but to make it easier to get buy-in from friendly countries that, uh, that might basically, especially democratic countries where the populace might agree with the changes that we're demanding. In particular, places like Canada. Um, but another issue that we have to deal with that no other president has had to deal with is that, if he had done it with a 90-day deadline, the opponents of the tariff would have to find just one judge somewhere in the country um, to put a temporary restraining order in to affect the start by date, and from a negotiating point of view, that would that would make it much harder for the for the judiciary to come into the process now that the tariffs are actually in place, and other legislators are going to have to step into high gear if they want to keep trading with the United States on our current uh, with the previous regime of tariffs. I understand that tariffs and trade restrictions are a two-person game, and that you have to be willing to take risks, to play that game. But uh, you know, people are very distrustful of each other now, whereas they weren't 20 years ago in the United States, and I think that our ability to maneuver is just lower because of that. Now, I was thinking about what you were saying about building a stockpile of goods. Well, that's great. We thought we had a stockpile of masks and gloves, right? And the Obama administration didn't refill the stockpile and didn't tell anybody, right? And then we thought we had funded uh, millions of doses of smallpox vaccine. Then when monkeypox hit the United States, it turns out that the CDC just decided not to pick the vaccine that they had paid for up. Right? They didn't have somebody go to inspect the goods before it got shipped in the Netherlands, and when the monkeypox hit, the goods were still in vat. The vaccines were still in vats in the Netherlands, even though we had paid for the vaccines. So I think that having a stockpile of strategic goods is a good idea from a public policy point of view. We may not be able to maintain that because the next time we have an administration like the Obama administration that has no respect for the law and no respect for the populace, uh, you know, all you know, all the rules are out the window. And the thing about tariffs is that they're immediate and they're public, and there's no funny business that you can really worry about. People aren't going to be bribing custom inspectors to not pay tariffs. It's something that's transparent and obvious and unavoidable. Maybe it's not the best. Maybe it's not the best tool to use, but maybe that's the only tool we have.
I think you're right that the tariff approach is much more enforceable from an accountability perspective with regard to whether or not the population is able to hold our leadership and their feet to the fire. Well, unless you have more, I think this is actually a very good stopping point.
Cool.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I was able to articulate what I see as being the benefits of the new tariff policies, as well as perhaps an alternative approach that may, in fact, be more effective. But we will find out, and that is, I think that we should keep an open mind. So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the discussion, then like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any inconvenient questions yourself about the topic we discussed today, then please leave a comment in the comment sections below. See you again next week.